What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and a few weeks ago, I went through all of the weapon abilities in Warhammer 40k and compared them to one another, and y'all seem to like that. So we're back again doing the same thing, but this time with core stratagems. Now, core stratagems are stratagems that are included within the core rulebook. There is also an additional core stratagem that we're going to be talking about today that comes out of the mission format. I'm going to be talking about this in the context of the Pariah Nexus mission format. I have a whole separate video that discusses exactly how that works. Now, these are tools in your toolbox. They're not necessarily meant to directly compete with one another. So what we're going to be doing is, instead of ranking them in a tier list like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we're going to be talking about them in terms of how often they will get used. So our top category is going to be stratagems that are used every game, then sometimes, occasionally, rarely, and basically never. Now, this is basically discussing their cadence of usage in a normal game. There are going to be some stratagems that you should probably be using every game or considering use every game, and there are some stratagems that you might be overusing, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, this is obviously going to be biased a little bit based on faction and list build and the available keywords that you have to you, but some stratagems that are unlocked by keywords are incredibly powerful and should get used very often when you have them available. We're going to rip the band-aid off really quick here with one of the top ones, Command Reroll. And I'm going to throw this one right at the top of the list. Right in the use every game. Command Reroll is extremely powerful. You get to reroll a dice roll. Now, there is a limited selection of the things that you can reroll. Most often, you're going to see it used for saving throws and charge rolls, but you'll find that in particularly close games, oftentimes players will use it for individual wound rolls or damage rolls in order to ensure that they get the kills that they need to. But having dice fixing in a game as dice dependent as Warhammer 40,000 is incredibly powerful. And that's why Command Reroll is probably the most oftenly used stratagem in the entire game, almost regardless of what faction you're in. This stratagem is where a lot of your command points will be going. Now, one thing to keep in mind with Command Reroll is that it doesn't let you reroll any dice roll. That was a thing in prior editions where any dice roll that you rolled was available to Command Reroll, so you could do it on things like Feel No Pains or mortal wound damage from explosions, for example. There is a strict list of things that you can use it on, those being advance rolls, charge rolls, desperate escape tests, hazardous tests, hit rolls, wound rolls, damage rolls, or saving throws. The number one mistake I see people making with this stratagem is using it or trying to use it on battle shock or leadership tests. You can't do that. You can use it on desperate escape tests, which are oftentimes associated with battle shock tests, but the two aren't the same thing. So don't use it on battle shock. You can't do that. There's another stratagem involving battle shock that we'll talk about later. Next up, we have counter offensive. This is a stratagem that allows you to attack after one of your opponent's units is attacked, breaking the normal attack sequence. Now, I'm going to put this one in the use occasionally category. Not because I think the stratagem is bad, but because it is often overused. It is a 2 command point stratagem, so it's incredibly expensive. That is your entire command point budget outside of additional abilities for an entire battle round. And while holding it up to your opponent, meaning that you have the resources available to use it, can make your opponent think twice about overextending their melee into you. One thing I see people do a lot of times is immediately windmill slam a counter offensive as soon as it becomes available to them to attack with anything in their army. And 2 command points to attack with units that aren't necessarily that great at fighting is oftentimes not that good. Now, there are going to be situations where you have a powerful melee unit that gets charged by 2 enemy units, for example, and doesn't get killed by the first one, gets left on a few wounds, and you counter offensive to neutralize the second one so that your melee unit doesn't die that turn. That is an incredibly good use of counter offensive. Or if your opponent has charged 2 of your own powerful units and attacked with one of them and killed them, but the other one can then counter offensive to survive. Those are very good uses of counter offensive, but if you're simply using it to make attacks and try to deal some damage to your opponent, it is oftentimes not useful in those situations. So you'll find that most games, it actually doesn't come up. It depends on the matchup, and it depends on the exact situation that you're in. Generally speaking, you want to get a unit's worth of value out of a 2CP stratagem. You want to be able to have your unit that is counter offending either kill an enemy unit or deal enough damage to survive itself. In those instances, it is incredibly useful. And there are some other instances where you can use it to get precision attacks on an enemy character, or bring an enemy unit down below the threshold where they can take an objective, for example, even if you're not killing them, and those are also super useful. But I do see players a lot of times just slam it down on the table to attack an enemy power armored unit with some intercessors or something, and you're just wasting your command points at that point. Next up, we have Epic Challenge. Now, this is going to go down in the use rarely category. We actually talked in the last video about how situational precision is as a weapon keyword, and Epic Challenge gives one of your characters precision against your opponent. Now, this has a lot of counterplay from the other player. They can keep their characters out of line of sight or keep their characters out of danger, but it is a good tool in the toolbox for situations where you get a very powerful melee character into a unit that is relying on their own character, or has a powerful character on their own that is going to deal damage to you, or that is protecting that unit or providing them some buff. Some things to keep in mind are the restrictions of the precision keyword. You have to have line of sight to the character that you are targeting, and any leadership abilities that they are conferring to their unit actually persist through after they're destroyed, per the rules commentary, through that same fight activation. So for example, if you have two characters leading a unit and one of them epic challenges the other and kills them, any leadership effects they would have persist until the rest of that unit attacks. So even if you have a bunch of Space Marines or Vanguard veterans or something attacking into an enemy that was getting a feel no pain from a character, even if you killed that character in a challenge in that same fight activation, those Vanguard veterans would still be fighting into that feel no pain even though the character was gone. So there are a lot of situations where precision is not the greatest keyword to get, but there also are a lot of situations where it's, again, a powerful tool in your toolbox where you can clip out a character that's particularly important. So it's always one to think about. I could precision this character. Is it worth doing? But the situations where it's worth the command point are actually fairly rare. The other thing to think about with precision is that characters tend to be the toughest models in a unit to destroy. They have to invulnerable saves and oftentimes feel no pains and a higher wound count. So the question you have to ask yourself is my attacks that could each probably destroy one of the bodyguards in a unit that is being led by a character, and therefore reduce the incoming damage from those bodyguards, get their objective control off the table, and make that unit generally easier to kill, is that worth attacking into the stronger defenses of the character? And many times it's not, but in some cases, you really want to set yourself up to kill them. So again, a tool in the toolbox, but not one that you use very often. Next up is Fire Overwatch. And this is probably going to be a very controversial decision. But I'm going to put Fire Overwatch somewhere around the level of counteroffensive. This is a stratagem that I think is very similar to counteroffensive, gets overused by folks in the community. A lot of people say, hey, as soon as I have the ability to fire Overwatch, I'm going to slam it down, I'm going to say my Fire Overwatch, I'm going to fire a bunch of 6-up ballistic scale, essentially gunshots into my opponent's army. And that is absolutely not the situation in which you need to use it. You need to be considering the volume of attacks that you're making at your opponent, the value of your attacks, and the value that you'll get from dealing damage to your opponent. Now, there are a lot of instances where Overwatch is amazing. Torrent weapons, for example, automatically hit. They don't need to roll 6s to hit like normal weapons do when firing Overwatch, and those are a special case. Those totally change how Overwatch plays out in a game, because if you have strong units with strong torrent weapons, your opponent has to play around them and has to play around the threat of Fire Overwatch. In most other situations, firing Overwatch is not worthwhile unless you either have a ridiculous volume of attacks. I'm talking you're attacking 30 or 40 times with a unit, or you have hit rerolls or very impressive sustained values that grant your 6s to hit additional value and essentially grant you additional accuracy bonuses. So if you are rerolling your hits, you're automatically hitting, or your hits are generating some additional value, like getting extra automatic hits. In those instances, Fire Overwatch is an interesting option. In most other situations, it is not. And I do see people use it a lot to just take pot shots at your opponent and maybe deal 1 or 2 damage, and it's definitely not worth the command points in that instance. There are some situations in which you want to be dealing specific amounts of damage to your opponent, and in those cases, you would consider firing Overwatch more strongly, but those are specific instances. For example, if you have a wounded infantry model that you particularly want to get rid of in a unit that you could potentially kill after a unit has moved, for example, and even if it's a low odds to get reasonable damage onto your opponent. They have a Wounded Custodian Guardsman in their squad, for example, and you could get a very high value model off the table for use of that Overwatch. Or if your opponent has exactly enough objective control to contest you and killing a single model would prevent that, then firing Overwatch feels a lot better. But those are very unique circumstances, and those are the things you have to think about when you're using the stratagem. Is it worth my expenditure? If I'm only trying to deal any amount of damage to my opponent, that's probably not worth it. But if I'm trying to attack with a specific goal and all I need is 1 or 2 damage, then Overwatch makes a lot of sense. Or if I have a very powerful weapon that is specifically good in Overwatch, that it gets rerolls or automatic hits, for example. Next up, we have Go to Ground. This is an easy one. This is right at the bottom. Basically never. This is almost certainly the least used and probably the least powerful core stratagem in 40k. It gives you cover and a 6+ invulnerable save on an infantry unit only. Now, I'm not going to say it is never used, and interestingly, one thing that we didn't talk about when we talked about command reroll is that it is a battle tactic, and if you're playing using on the balanced data slate, you can only use free stratagem effects with battle tactics like command reroll or Go to Ground. So if you have effects like a Space Marine Captain who has Rights of Battle and he can use stratagems for free, the only core stratagems that he has available to him for use there is command reroll on his own unit or going to ground to give him cover and invulnerable save. Now, obviously, you'll usually get additional access from your detachments for those, but that is something to keep in mind that in some instances you will be getting 1 or 2 of these for free. Given how cover works in 10th edition, most units in the game have cover like most of the time, at least a little bit. Most of the time when your opponent is attacking you, especially with an infantry unit that tends to be high model count, so their models tend to be strung out pretty far, a lot of times 1 or 2 of those models are going to be in cover, and that's where you're going to be taking saves first. So you very rarely get the full use out of Go to Ground where you get everybody in cover all the time. In addition, it is rare with the limited AP values, armor penetration values in 10th edition, that you punch all the way through your opponent's armor save. So a 6+ invulnerable save, it doesn't come into play that often, and even when it does, you're only affecting infantry with it, and your opponent has been removing all of their armor save. A 6+ invulnerable save is not going to save them, for example, unless you have a lot of additional defensive technology backing it up. I think in the almost a year we're on of 10th edition, I don't believe I have personally ever used Go to Ground. I think I maybe have seen it used against me once or twice, and there are definitely situations in which you would consider it. Oh, I have Custodian Guardsmen that have a lot of defensive mechanics and are out in the open and have a strong armor save already and are being attacked with a medium AP weapon. Go to Ground can keep them on a 2+ armor save. Maybe worth it in that instance. In almost every other situation, you're probably better off saving your command points. Now, the same is not the case for the next one that we have on the list. That is Grenade. That's going to be thrown into the use sometimes category here. Now, Grenade is super strong, and the stratagems that I put in use all the time are going to be ones that are basically just kind of like designed into the fabric of the game, command rerolls being a really good example. Grenade isn't quite the same level as that. It is not a transformative stratagem that can change how the core mechanics of 40k work, but armies that have wide access to the Grenade stratagem, I would be surprised if there was not a meaningful difference in their win percentage, because this stratagem allows you to smooth your attacks over way more efficiently than other factions. It deals on average 3 mortal wounds to somebody within 8 inches before you attack with your unit, which allows you to punch damage into high value, high defensive characteristic enemies without actually having to roll any attacks or give them the opportunity to respond. It's not an attack, so it doesn't trigger enemy on target abilities or stratagems. It is mortal wounds, so it goes through any defensive technology besides feel no pain, and you can use it in basically any situation. I actually have an entire video about how ridiculous this stratagem is, but this stratagem could be used in a dizzying array of situations. Fall back, you can't shoot, you can still grenade. Advance, no assault weapons, doesn't matter, you can still grenade. The only time you can't grenade is if you or your target is in melee or you have already fired your weapons. In literally any other instance, if you have the keyword, you can grenade and deal mortal wounds and be dealing damage to your opponent. And then in the situations where you want to make a kill on a very specific enemy target, especially one that has strong defenses, more mathematically likely, Grenade is a godsend. In addition, there are many factions in the game that do not have access to amazing in-faction stratagems and have a lot of additional command points left over. Grenade allows them to basically be dealing passive damage in each of their shooting phases to their opponent's army over the course of the game without really having to roll many dice. It's not like firing Overwatch where you are rolling a bunch of dice and hoping for sixes and just sort of hoping that the luck gods are with you. Grenade is a very consistent 3 mortal wounds, or even more. Sometimes you can spike and absolutely destroy someone. Next up, we have Heroic Intervention. This is another one that I'm going to throw into the use rarely category. That is because, I think I'm going to put it up ahead of Epic Challenge here. It is an incredibly powerful effect, but has the potential to blow up in your face if you make a mistake and you use it at the wrong time, and it is a 2 CP stratagem, so it uses a lot of your command point budget. Now, here's why this stratagem can be so dangerous to use. It allows you to charge in your opponent's charge phase. That sounds incredible. It's an interruption of their normal charge sequence. It can mess with their charges, and it can give you the opportunity to attack on their turn. However, it does not confer to you the charge bonus, which is the Fight's First ability, which would allow you to fight before any charging units. While it does unlock other effects that require you to make a charge move that turn, for example, you're eligible to fight even if you don't have any enemies in engagement range of you, because you did literally charge that turn. And if you have other effects, like you're playing World Eaters, for example, and you get an attack and strength bonus when you make a charge move, that will also trigger on Heroic Intervention. Those are not the quote-unquote charge bonus that are described in the core rules. Those are just an ability that unlocks when you charge. It's a little confusing, but that is how it works. Because you don't get to fight first, your opponent, unless you have the Fight First ability baked in, will get to swing before you. So if you charge into an enemy unit, and they are a powerful melee unit because they're coming in to engage you, and they swing first, you can potentially be feeding them your models in an instance where you wouldn't normally do that. However, if they are not a strong melee unit, Heroic Intervention skyrockets in value. If you have a powerful unit that's going to do a ton of damage to them and they are charging into you, they've probably made a mistake. They should have considered the fact that you're holding up 2 CP to heroically intervene. And if that allows you then to attack and kill them, that's a big deal. So there are situations when Heroic Intervention can totally flip the game on its head. But they are extremely rare and good players will play around them. What it can allow you to do is potentially move models around during your opponent's turn and potentially change how scoring operates. For example, you can stop them from scoring secondary objectives by contesting those objectives using a Heroic Intervention move. That could be crazy. And you can use that move to get onto new objectives to then score them in your command phase when you would normally go to the scoring section. Those are all great uses of this stratagem, but there is a risk to it. Not only could you potentially have the risk where your opponent fights you back and does a bunch of damage to you before you get to fight, but also it is a charge roll. So you have to pick up 2d6 and roll a high enough number on those dice that if you were to move that distance, you would get into engagement range of that target unit. So there's a reasonable chance in many situations, especially if you are making a 6 or a 5-inch charge, or there are intervening models in terrain or terrain that you would then have to move around, that you fail that charge and pay 2 command points to do literally nothing. So that is another thing that you have to keep in mind. If you have access to a command reroll, for example, then it makes the use of Heroic Intervention feel much better, but just using Heroic Intervention willy-nilly can come back to bite you and burn a ton of CP and get actually no value out of it. It's definitely a thing to keep in mind, both playing with and against it, but it is another stratagem that is only useful in very rare circumstances. Now we're moving on to Insane Bravery. This is going to be another one up in this use sometimes category here. Pre the rewrite that Insane Bravery got in the balanced data slate, it almost certainly would have been up in this use every game category. It was so strong on release of 40k that it got massive nerfs to its power level. This stratagem basically made the entire battle shock mechanic, at least as it is described in the core rulebook, where you take battle shock test in your battle shock step if you're below half of starting strength. It essentially made that mechanic absolutely useless. It was so strong. In the current version, it is a stratagem that you will will use, if not once a game, once every other game or so. The timing of this stratagem is really important. It occurs if you're using the balanced data slate before you roll a battle shock check for a unit in the battle shock step. This means that it can't be used to automatically pass any battle shock tests outside of that step. So if your opponent is forcing battle shock on you with Shadow in the Warp or an ability that they have, you cannot use Insane Bravery on it. And you don't know what the result of your battle shock test is at the time that you decide to use the stratagem. However, what it does let you do is ensure that you are scoring in situations where your opponent has made it dicey. If you have a leadership 6 or 7 unit that would be potentially worth 5 or more victory points by holding objectives or moving to complete secondaries or even moving to contest enemy objectives, using Insane Bravery to keep them topped up at their full fighting effectiveness can be incredibly powerful. If you consider that throughout the course of a game of 40k, there are probably, I would say, 3 to 4 battle shock tests that can meaningfully change the result of a game. And most units in 40k will say on average pass about 60% of those. A use of Insane Bravery removes 25 to 30% of those tests from the pool and ensures that you automatically pass those. So identifying the situations in which a passed battle shock test could hurt your final score and the final result of the game is crucial to knowing when to use Insane Bravery. That said, it is such a powerful effect that you will probably be using it in many of your games. I'm not going to say every single game because the situation doesn't come up, but when it does, you windmill slam it, you get yourself a bunch of points, and you don't leave it up to chance whether or not you become battle shocked or not. Next up is going to be Rapid Ingress, and that is going up into the use every game category. Now, I don't really mean this in that you literally use it every game, because you're not always going to be reserving units in every game. Depending on the army that you're playing and the matchup and the mission and the situation, you may or may not have included units in reserve. And if you don't have anybody in reserve, Rapid Ingress doesn't really do you much good. However, if you are playing a faction or an army archetype that utilizes reserves or strategic reserves to an extent, Rapid Ingress is an enormous tool in the toolbox. This ability between 9th and 10th edition, this stratagem, I think, entirely redefined how the reinforcement step of 40k operates and the first and second player dynamic in the game. In 9th edition and in previous editions, the first player got the first opportunity to bring their units up into the table, and on top of that also got 2 movement phases, the first movement phase and the second movement phase, to screen out the second player's reinforcements, making it so that the player going second had a massive disadvantage if both armies relied heavily on reserves. Rapid Ingress flipped that on its head. Instead, now the second player gets the first opportunity to Rapid Ingress, and the first player is the one that has to be screening more aggressively because a Rapid Ingress at an inopportune time could ruin their entire game. Not to mention the fact that this stratagem has made it so that melee-focused reserve units, which in past editions were some of the worst units in 40k, are now incredibly strong. Instead of just dropping down and hoping you roll a 9-inch charge out of Deep Strike, Rapid Ingress allows you to drop down, move, apply buffs, get yourself into a good position, then charge, and that is, in and of itself, enormous. And even if you're not using units that are good with Rapid Ingress, presenting the threat to your opponent can often change how they operate as well. A little bit of a mind game you can do is remind your opponent that you could Rapid Ingress into a position and force them to then move out aggressively and screen you, even in a situation where you wouldn't normally Rapid Ingress, where the units that you have wouldn't necessarily be that great for it. And that forces additional cognitive load on the player screening against the Rapid Ingress and can totally change how they operate. This stratagem is so strong, and especially in armies that use reserves, you are probably going to be using it almost every game. Even if you're an army that doesn't use reserves, most of the time you are going to be playing against some level of strategic reserves, and you have to keep it in your back of your mind. This is a enormously transformative stratagem for 40k. And that is similar to the next one that we have on the list, New Orders. We're going to throw that right up next to, I think we're going to put it next to Command Reroll in this use every game category. Now, I want to talk specifically about the Pariah Nexus version of New Orders that has been leaked and is being used in the new Pariah Nexus mission set. This New Orders allows you, at the end of each of your command phases, you can pay a command point to use the stratagem, and you can discard one of your secondary objective cards and get a new one if you're using tactical objectives. This is huge. It gives you so much control over your hand of objectives and your ability to score victory points, and I don't know if I need to say much else about that because stratagems like Insane Bravery have a potential effect on how much you score. New Orders allows you to, as long as you have the command points to fuel it, never be hurt by a bad secondary objective draw again. And even if you do get hit by a really terrible stack of secondaries, you can start to filter those out of your deck and get a better draw of cards in future turns. New Orders is absolutely crucial for players playing tactical secondaries, and the newest version out of Pariah Nexus is way more powerful than the version out of Leviathan that I probably would have put a tier or so below. Next up, we've got Tank Shock. That's going to be going into probably the use occasionally section right here. There are a lot of instances, and I think it's kind of like Fire Overwatch, where Tank Shock, I think it's overused a little bit. And I will, I guess, disclose a little bias here that Tank Shock kind of annoys me that it is so restrictive on the units that can use it. And similar to grenades, the units that have the correct keywords to use it, that being specifically a vehicle with a high strength melee weapon, get huge benefits out of Tank Shock, but those are few and far between. Tank Shock allows you to do an absolute boatload of mortal wounds on the charge, but it does require you to charge, and it mostly requires that your strength value is fairly high to begin with. This can allow you to do a bunch of different things. It can allow you to charge, kill a weak unit, and then pile into a second unit and attack them, or inflict damage in a strong enemy unit in order to make your attacks against them in the future more reliable. You could also use it to chip off 1 or 2 wounds that you need to clear out an enemy unit, even on a low strength vehicle. However, one thing I see players do is windmill slam Tank Shock in any situation where they're charging with a vehicle, and that is rarely advisable. Dealing 1 or 2 mortal wounds with a unit that you're then engaging in melee is nice, but not usually worth the command point. You need to be in a situation where you're using it for a specific purpose for it to be worth it, and you have to keep in mind that there is the potential, it's a very swingy mechanic. You're trying to roll 5 ups on a bunch of d6, which can go very, very poorly for you, and the stratagem is capped, so you can only ever do 6 mortal wounds, so you can't necessarily rely on Tank Shock to do exactly what you want to. Now, last and maybe least over here, we have Smokescreen. I think this one's also going to be put into the use occasionally category here. This is just, it might be a little bit of a whimper to end on for this video. It's just a good strat, that's all. It gives you stealth and cover. The cover, as I mentioned before in Go to Ground portion of the stratagem, doesn't tend to be that useful because oftentimes you're in cover, especially with a large vehicle that has the Smokescreen keyword anyway. But stealth is just generally a good benefit to have. It makes you harder to kill, it can totally change your opponent's math in many instances, and you can stack it with other defensive mechanics. Many armies that are relying on Smokescreen will also have Feel No Pains or AP reduction or damage reduction from other stratagems. They can use Smokescreen on one unit, for example. Your opponent retargets to attack a second unit and you use your other defensive buffs there. So it's just a nice thing to have. In many cases, you could use it on even diminutive units like Rhinos, for example, that can slam an armor penetration characteristic reduction and Smokescreen, so you're -1 to hit and -1 AP, and they're in cover, and actually make those very, very light units extremely difficult to kill, especially in Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines. And for those reasons, it's just a solid stratagem. It is pretty rare to have the smoke keyword, and there are some units where it's really not really worth it. You can see units like that already have stealth baked in that have the smoke keyword, for example, which is a little bit silly. But the units that do have it, it is very nice to have. It's not used every single game, but it's certainly something that your opponent has to work around when they're playing against them. Just pretty good deal. Stealth for CP? pretty solid. And with that, those are all of the core stratagems in Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment section if you agreed with my list and what you thought about my takes on these stratagems and your experiences in 40k and in the new Pariah Nexus format using them. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. And thanks as well to everybody who watched the original video where we talked about weapon keywords, because that one kind of blew up a little bit, which I didn't really expect. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and as always, have happy wargaming.